The last thing my father's company ever gave me was a black garbage bag, stuffed with whatever I could grab in 7 minutes, and the sound of a deadbolt sliding home on the other side of a solid oak door. I was 23 years old, standing on the stone steps of a $7 million home in Oakville that I had lived in since I was 8, in the middle of a February that had no interest in being kind to anyone. The wind off Lake Ontario cuts differently in February. It doesn't push against you. It finds the gaps between your collar and your neck, between your sleeve and your glove, and it settles in there like it belongs. My stepmother, Nadine, stood just inside the front entrance, arms folded across her chest, wearing the kind of composed expression that people practice in mirrors. Beside her was her son from her first marriage, Logan, 26. Already 2 years into the junior VP title, my father had handed him like a birthday gift. Logan wasn't even trying to look neutral. He had the flat, satisfied look of someone who had been waiting a long time for exactly this moment. "You've been an adult for 5 years now," Nadine said through the narrow gap before she pulled the door the rest of the way shut. "Your father is gone. This house, everything, passed to me. If I see you on this property again, I'll call the police." The latch clicked. I stood there long enough for the cold to start working through my sneakers. My father, Martin Howell, had built Howell Meridian Construction from a single dump truck he'd bought secondhand when he was 27. He spent 30 years turning it into one of the largest commercial real estate development firms in Ontario. He was not the kind of man you expected to die at 61 of a cardiac event, alone in his home office on a Tuesday afternoon in November. The will reading came 12 days after the funeral. Our family lawyer, Randall, had known my father since their university days at Queen's. He had come to my hockey games. He had eaten at our Thanksgiving table. He sat behind a glass and chrome desk and told me, without making eye contact once, that my father had signed a new will 25 days before his death. Every asset, the company, the properties, the investment accounts, the numbered holding companies, went entirely to Nadine. I received a one-time payment of $15,000, which Randall told me was currently tied up in the estate administration process and would be disbursed in due course. It was not disbursed. I spent the first 3 weeks living out of my old Subaru Outback in the parking lot behind a 24-hour Tim Hortons on the QEW. I had enough in my personal checking account to manage for a while. Not long, but a while. I rationed carefully. I drove to a gym and paid the daily rate to use the showers. I sat in the warm car and tried to understand how my father, who used to rub my shoulders after a bad game and say, "We're all right, kid, we're always all right," could have signed a document that left me with nothing. It didn't fit. None of it fit. My father was meticulous. He annotated his calendars in 3 colors. He kept paper backups of everything digital. He did not make major financial decisions impulsively, and he certainly did not revise a will that he had spent years carefully constructing 25 days before dying of a heart attack. It wasn't until the 4th week that I opened the tool chest. My father had kept an old wooden ice fishing gearbox in the back of his workshop, the kind with deep metal clasps and a handle worn smooth from years of use. It was the one thing I'd grabbed on my way out the door, mainly because it was sitting on the workbench nearest the entrance, and my hands went to it automatically, the way hands reach for familiar things when everything else is falling apart. I'd thrown it into the back of the Outback without thinking. I finally opened it one night parked under a yellow service light behind a grocery store off Dundas. I unlatched the clasps and lifted the lid. The smell that came out, machine oil, dried rubber, faint traces of lake water, hit me somewhere behind the sternum. My father had taken me ice fishing on Lake Simcoe every winter, from the time I was 6 until I was 15. He packed this box himself every December, checking every item the same way, twice, same order, every year. I ran my fingers along the top tray. Augers, tip-ups, thermal gloves in a zip bag, spare line. I pressed down on the tray to slide it aside and something shifted wrong. Not the soft flecks of plastic over empty space, something rigid underneath. I pressed again. A short click from beneath the tray. I pried up the edge with my car key. The tray lifted clean off in one piece, a false bottom. Underneath it, on a square of dark felt, sat a folded sheet of lined paper, the kind torn from a spiral notebook, and a small brass key on a loop of green garden twine. My hands weren't steady when I unfolded the paper. The handwriting was my father's, and it was rushed in a way I had never seen from him before. He wrote like he was running out of time. If you're reading this, then I didn't get it sorted in time. I'm sorry. Nadine and Randall have been working against me for months. I believe they've interfered with the legal documents, and my cardiologist has had me on a new medication protocol since September that leaves me too foggy to fight them the way I need to. Do not trust Randall. Do not go to the local police. He has relationships there going back 20 years. I couldn't put anything in your name directly. She would have found it in Discovery. Instead, TD Bank, King Street Branch, downtown Toronto. Box 1147. Use the key. I love you, Dad. P.S. Look up. The P.S. made no sense at the time. The next morning I used the last quarter tank of gas to drive into the city. I walked into the TD Bank branch on King Street wearing the same jeans I'd slept in and 3 days of stubble. The woman at the customer service desk looked at me the way people look at someone who doesn't quite belong in the space they've walked into. I showed her my ID and the brass key. She took me to the back. 10 minutes later, I was sitting alone in a small viewing room with a long metal safety deposit box on the table in front of me. I opened it. Inside, a single manila envelope and a second key, smaller, modern, with a red rubber grip and the number 4 scratched into it with something sharp. The envelope held a property deed. The registered owner was listed as 2291847 Ontario, Inc. A numbered company, the kind that looks like nothing until you know what you're looking for. Attached to the deed was a one-page notarized document naming me as the sole director and shareholder of 2291847 Ontario, Inc., signed and witnessed by a notary public in Peterborough, whose name I didn't recognize. Nadine's lawyers would have been searching my father's personal estate, not a numbered company. She would have missed it entirely. The property was in Haliburton County, a rural address on a road I'd never heard of, northeast of the village of Minden. My father had never mentioned Haliburton to me once in my life. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I looked at the second key with the number 4 scratched into it, put everything back into the envelope, and walked out of the bank. I stopped at a gas station on the 401 and bought a paper map of Ontario, the old-fashioned kind, because my phone was running low on data and I didn't want to risk losing signal in the Haliburton Highlands. I filled the tank and bought a coffee and 2 granola bars. Then I drove north. The Haliburton Highlands in February are not gentle. The highway narrows as you push past Barrie and Orillia, and by the time you're past Lindsay and climbing into the rock and pine country north of Kinmount, the landscape stops being scenic and starts being honest. Everything is gray and white and very, very quiet. The road the GPS led me down, once I found enough signal to use it, wasn't plowed past a certain point. I engaged the 4-wheel drive on the outback and crept the last 2 kilometers through fresh snow, branches scraping the roof, until the trees opened into a clearing. I stopped the car and sat for a second. The cabin was a disaster. It was a 2-story log structure, maybe 100 years old, with a collapsed section on the east side of the porch roof and a plywood board nailed over what used to be a front window. The exterior chinking between the logs had crumbled in patches. A rusted tin stovepipe stuck out from one wall at a slight angle, as though it had been leaning against the cold long enough to give up. "This is what you left me," I said to the empty car. I knew immediately that I was being unfair. My father didn't leave me a ruin. He left me something invisible, something Nadine's lawyers couldn't find, in a province where property records weren't being searched under a numbered company. This was intentional. This was shelter of a different kind. I got out of the outback and waded through the snow to the front door. The red grip key slid into the padlock without resistance, which surprised me. Everything else about the place looked like it had been frozen shut for a decade. The padlock opened cleanly. I pushed the door inward. The cold inside was a different kind of cold than outside, stagnant, thick with the smell of old wood and dust and something faintly mineral, like well water. I turned on my phone's flashlight and swept it across the interior. Furniture had been pushed to the walls and covered with tarps, most of them gray with dust. There was a cast iron wood stove in the corner and a stack of split birch beside it that was dry enough to burn. The plank floors were thick with dust, weeks of it, maybe months, and the beam of my flashlight moved across the floor until it caught something that stopped me mid-step. Footprints. Not mine. Mine were the fresh tracks of hiking boots from the door inward. These were different, heavy, deep-treaded, the kind of sole pattern you see on work boots meant for rough terrain. The edges of the tracks in the dust were crisp, not old. Someone had been here in the last few days. My first thought was Nadine. She was methodical and well-resourced, and if she'd suspected my father had hidden assets under a numbered company, she would have hired someone to find them. The question was whether they'd found what they were looking for. I gripped my keys in my fist and followed the tracks. They led through the main room, into a back hallway, and then into what had been used as a small office, a wooden desk, 2 drawers pulled out and upended, papers scattered across the floor. Someone had searched it hard and fast. I thought about my father's note, "Look up." I aimed the flashlight at the ceiling of the office. Flat plank boards, nothing unusual. I backed out into the hallway and followed the boot tracks to the staircase. They went up. The second floor was 2 rooms, a bathroom and a bedroom with a single iron frame bed and a large cedar wardrobe against the far wall. The boot tracks went into the bedroom and stopped at the wardrobe. The wardrobe door was standing open, searched. I stepped into the bedroom. Cold air moved across the back of my neck from somewhere above. I looked at the ceiling. The bedroom ceiling had been done in acoustic tile panels at some point, the kind from the 1970s, white with small holes pressed into them in a grid pattern. One tile, in the far corner, directly above the wardrobe, was sitting a few millimeters out of position, not enough to notice unless you were looking. But the gap it left showed a thin line of absolute dark above it. Look up. I climbed onto the cedar wardrobe, testing its weight carefully. It held. I reached up and pressed both palms flat against the misaligned tile and pushed. It slid aside. Dust rained down across my face. I blinked it away and pointed the flashlight up into the gap. An aluminum folding ladder was stored flat just inside the opening, the kind that extends when you pull it down. The person who'd searched this cabin had gone through the wardrobe. They hadn't looked up. I pulled the ladder down. The metallic extension rattled and clanked in the cold silence of the house. I steadied it, took a breath, and climbed up into the attic. The attic ran the full length of the cabin. The pitched roof gave it maybe 6 feet of clearance at the center peak, and the floor was rough plywood over the ceiling joists. I stood up and panned my flashlight from one end to the other. At the far end of the attic, in the corner where the roof pitch met the exterior wall, something caught the light. A safe. Not a lockbox, not a small fireproof cabinet. A full upright safe, maybe 4 feet tall and 2 feet wide, bolted directly to the structural timber of the cabin at the base and the top, gray steel with a matte finish. It looked completely out of place here, like someone had carried a piece of equipment from a commercial bank vault into the middle of a century-old hunting cabin and simply bolted it down. I moved toward it as quickly as I could manage across the uneven plywood. The digital keypad on the front was destroyed. Not just damaged, someone had taken something heavy to it, repeatedly. The plastic casing was shattered. The wiring inside hung in loose loops, and the steel around the keypad housing was dented and scored with deep marks. An angle grinder, probably. They'd tried to get in through the lock mechanism and failed. I lowered myself to my knees in front of it. They were here before me. They'd found the attic. They'd found the safe, and they couldn't get through the door. I stayed on my knees for a long moment, the flashlight resting on the plywood floor, throwing uneven light across the face of the safe. Then I made myself look more carefully, because my father was not the kind of man who built a dead end. Taped to the side of the destroyed keypad housing, the section that had taken the least damage, was a small piece of yellow notepad paper. The tape had yellowed around the edges but was still holding. I leaned in close. My father's handwriting again, even tighter and more urgent than the note in the fishing box. If the pad is broken, look behind the panel. The bank key. I pulled the red grip key from my pocket. I found the edge of the keypad housing with my thumbnail and pried. The entire housing came away in a section, the remaining screws pulling loose. Behind it, set into the bare steel of the safe door, was a round keyhole, mechanical, manual, completely untouched. The red grip key from the safety deposit box. I pushed it in, it seated perfectly. I turned it. The mechanism inside the door moved with a sound like a heavy clock, deep, deliberate, final. I found the lever handle on the front of the safe, braced one foot against the plywood, and pulled. The door swung open on hinges that hadn't been disturbed in years. I had to sit back and look at the wall for a second before I could process what I was seeing. The lower shelf of the safe held stacks of vacuum-sealed currency, hundreds, the kind you see in photographs but rarely in person, alongside 4 velvet bags that felt, when I picked one up, like they were full of stones. They were gold coins, maple leaf bullion, 1 troy ounce each, the kind the Royal Canadian Mint has produced for decades. Enough of them to be meaningful, enough of them to live on. But the middle shelf was what mattered. A black hardcover journal, cloth-bound, 2 USB drives in a Ziploc bag, each one labeled in red marker, and an envelope, sealed with 4 separate strips of packing tape, with a single word on the front in my father's handwriting, checkmate. I opened the envelope. The first document inside was a will. 12 pages, properly witnessed and notarized, dated 4 days before my father's death. He left the entirety of his estate, Howell Meridian Construction, all associated real property, all investment accounts and holding companies, to me. He specifically excluded Nadine and Logan, citing what the document called a fundamental breach of fiduciary trust and the deliberate circumvention of my legal intentions. The witnesses were 2 employees from his Peterborough satellite office whose names I recognized from holiday cards. I read it twice. Then I looked at the second document. It was a private toxicology report from a clinical laboratory in Ottawa, dated 6 weeks before my father's death. The report was addressed not to any hospital but to a private investigator whose business card was paperclipped to the first page. The report analyzed a pharmaceutical sample, described as capsules obtained from my father's personal medication supply under controlled circumstances, and identified a synthetic compound that had been introduced into what were labeled patient MH's cardiac maintenance capsules. My father had been on a daily beta-blocker regimen since his first minor cardiac episode 4 years earlier. Someone had been opening his capsules and replacing the medication with a compound designed to cause irregular heart rhythm under physical and emotional stress. Not immediately, not dramatically. Just steadily, over months, applying pressure to a heart that was already compromised. Then I found the printed emails. Dozens of pages, exchanges between Nadine's personal address and Randall's. They went back nearly a year. The early ones discussed the will revision, which notary to use, how to structure the timeline, how to keep the process out of the firm where my father's longtime paralegal worked. By the 4th month, the emails referenced a third party, referred to only by a first initial, described as managing the ongoing medical situation. There were payment references, amounts transferred to a credit union account in Hamilton. My father had figured it out. The journal made that clear. He had started secretly skipping doses of his medication, and on those days his thinking sharpened, his hands steadied. He hired the Ottawa investigator, scrambled to get the evidence documented, found a notary in Peterborough who had no connection to Randall, and hid everything here in a property Nadine had no reason to know existed. He ran out of time. I was still reading when I heard it. Tires on packed snow, the crunch of a vehicle turning into the clearing below. I killed my flashlight. In the sudden dark, I crept to the small circular vent window at the far gable end of the attic and looked down through the grimy glass. A dark pickup truck had parked directly behind my Outback in the narrow clearing. 2 men got out. The one from the driver's side was big, wearing a canvas work jacket and the exact tread of boots that had left the tracks on the cabin floor below. The one from the passenger side was wearing a charcoal wool overcoat and already had a phone to his ear. Even from 2 stories up in a February dark, I recognized the posture, the walk, the overcoat. Randall. The car's there. The big man's voice carried easily through the cold. He beat us to it. Then he's inside. Randall's voice was flat and clipped, nothing like the warm, measured tone from his King Street office. If he's seen what's in that safe, he doesn't drive back south. Make it look like an accident. Carbon monoxide, a fall, something the coroner won't look hard at. A cold that had nothing to do with February moved through my chest. I was 23 years old. I was alone in a cabin in the Haliburton Highlands with a man who had already searched this building and a lawyer who had helped kill my father. Then I looked at the journal in my left hand. The toxicology report, the USB drives, the real will. Something settled in me that was quieter and harder than fear. I moved as silently as I could across the attic plywood. I unzipped my backpack and loaded it. The currency, the gold coins, the journal, the drives, the sealed envelope. It was heavy. I cinched the straps as tight as they'd go and wore it on my chest rather than my back. Below me, the front door of the cabin was forced open. Heavy footsteps on the plank floor. I moved to the far end of the attic. The circular vent window was maybe 40 centimeters across, framed in old wood that had been freeze-thaw cycling for decades. I lay flat on my back, brought both feet up, and kicked through the frame. The wood exploded outward with a crack that rang through the entire structure. Cold air and darkness poured in. I pushed myself through the opening, the broken frame catching my jacket, and came out onto the snow-covered rear roofline. The pitch was steep, and the snow on the shingles was hard-packed and slick. I started sliding immediately. I clawed at the shingles with both hands, slowing myself enough that when I came off the edge, it was more of a controlled drop than a fall. I landed in a drift against the back foundation, sank to my hips, scrambled out sideways, and ran into the tree line. A flashlight beam cut through the broken vent window above me. I was already in the spruce. I ran north, angling away from the clearing, into the kind of Haliburton darkness that has no ambient light for 30 kilometers in any direction. The snow was knee-deep in places under the trees, and the low branches came at my face without warning. My hands went numb in the first 10 minutes. I kept moving. After what felt like close to an hour, I hit a plowed surface road, a county road, a single set of tire tracks on the fresh snow. I walked west. The pickup truck that stopped for me was driven by a woman who asked exactly 3 questions. Where was I going? Was I hurt? Did I need her to call someone? I said Minden. She drove me to a gas station on the edge of town. I went inside, bought a prepaid phone with the emergency cash from my jacket pocket, and sat down under the fluorescent lights long enough to stop shaking. I did not call the OPP. The journal was clear about Randall's connections going back 20 years. I called the RCMP. The constable who answered transferred me twice before connecting me to a duty sergeant from the commercial crime section in Aurelia. I told him I needed to report estate fraud involving assets in excess of $40 million, the falsification of a legal will, and evidence that prescription medication had been deliberately tampered with in a way that contributed to a death. I told him I had the original documents, 2 encrypted hard drives, and a toxicology report from an accredited Ottawa laboratory in my possession. There was a pause on the line. "Stay where you are," he said. "Don't go back to that property." By early the following morning, 2 plainclothes officers from the RCMP Commercial Crime Section were sitting across a laminate table from me in the Minden detachment. Their notebooks were open. I put the contents of my backpack onto the table between us, one item at a time: the drives, the will, the toxicology report, the printed emails. The senior officer, Sergeant Beaumont, read the first page of the toxicology report without changing her expression. Then she looked at her partner. Something passed between them that I didn't need to interpret. "We're going to need a full statement," she said. "A long one." The RCMP executed search warrants on a Thursday. I sat in an unmarked vehicle a block from the Oakville house and watched through the window as two cruisers and a dark sedan pulled into the driveway. Nadine came out through the front door in a camel-colored wrap coat, her wrists being guided carefully but firmly into restraints, and her face was wearing something I had never once seen on it before. Not composure, not control, just disbelief, the pure, unvarnished kind that belongs to someone who genuinely never considered that the world was capable of closing in around them. My stepbrother Logan appeared in the doorway 3 minutes later. He wasn't wearing a coat. He'd come to the door in a fleece pullover, and he stood on the front step looking at the officers and the vehicles with an expression I recognized. It was the same look he'd had behind the glass of that front door months earlier, watching me walk down the driveway. Except now none of the certainty was in it. Randall was arrested the same morning at his King Street office. The USB drives contained 3 years of financial records, transfers to the man who had carried out the physical work of searching the cabin, communications coordinating the will revision, and a broader pattern of asset diversion from Howell Meridian that the RCMP forensic accountants later described as one of the more methodical embezzlement schemes they had examined in the region. The private nurse, who had managed my father's in-home care and who had access to his daily medication blister packs, was also arrested. She cooperated with the Crown in exchange for a reduced charge. She testified that she had been approached first, that the arrangement had been in place for 9 months, and that the payments had gone into a separate account opened specifically to receive them. She received a conditional sentence. I thought that was insufficient. I still do. But it wasn't my decision to make, and my father's journal, which I had read 3 times by then, would have told me not to spend energy on it. The estate litigation took 8 months. The court voided the revised will on grounds of undue influence and fraud. The authentic will, notarized in Peterborough, witnessed by 2 people who had no connection to Randall, was admitted and validated without challenge. Nadine and Randall were charged under the criminal code with criminal fraud, conspiracy, and manslaughter. Both were remanded into custody pending trial. They will spend years, at minimum, in a federal institution. I was 24 when I formally took control of Howell Meridian Construction. I spent the first 3 months learning the company from the inside. Walking job sites, sitting with the project managers and site supervisors and the tradespeople my father had trusted with the actual work of building things. I cleared 2 board members who had been complicit in the financial diversion. I brought in a new CFO my father had named in his journal, a woman from a Hamilton firm who had done work for Howell Meridian years earlier and whom my father had described, in his own handwriting, as the most honest person I know in a dishonest industry. I sold the Oakville house. I couldn't be in it. It had a particular quality of stillness that had nothing to do with architecture and everything to do with what had happened inside it. I used a portion of the estate to establish a foundation in my father's name, the Martin Howell Cardiac Care Fund, administered in partnership with a hospital network in Toronto. The fund supports research into medication safety protocols and improved access to cardiac monitoring for people in rural and remote communities like Haliburton County, where a person could be alone with a failing heart for a very long time before anyone came. And then I fixed the cabin. I hired a local crew out of Minden, a contractor who had apparently done work for my father years earlier and who was visibly moved when I told him what had been found inside the building. We repaired the porch roof, repointed the log chinking on the east wall, put in proper insulation, replaced the wood stove with a larger cast iron unit, and ran a propane line for backup heat. The plank floors that had rotted through were replaced with new pine boards milled from timber salvaged from a barn on the same county road. The attic, where I had spent the worst and most important night of my life, I converted into a reading room. Wide shelves on 3 walls, an armchair from a second-hand shop in Haliburton Village, and a new window cut into the south gable that looks out over the spruce and birch of the Highlands. In winter, when the snow is heavy on the branches, there is nothing to see from that window but white and green, and the particular shade of gray that the sky gets at 4 in the afternoon in February. I find it the least lonely view I know. The safe is still there, bolted to the rafters. I couldn't move it if I wanted to, and I don't want to. I leave the door open. On the mantel above the wood stove in the main room, I keep my father's old ice fishing gearbox. The clasps are rusted, the handle is worn smooth. The false bottom is still inside, and the sheet of lined notepad paper is still folded where he put it, though I've read it so many times now that I have it memorized word for word, including the postscript. He knew he was running out of time. He knew the medication was affecting his thinking, and he still managed. In those windows of clarity when he skipped a dose and could reason clearly again, to build a path back to me through a safety deposit box and a numbered company and a hidden attic and a key with the number 4 scratched into the grip. He built it the way he had built everything else in his life. One step at a time, checking each piece twice, never assuming that someone else would carry the weight. There are people who believe that when you strip someone of everything, you've taken away their capacity to fight back. Nadine believed that. Randall believed that. They looked at a 23-year-old standing in a driveway with a garbage bag and a beat-up Outback and decided the problem had solved itself. They forgot one thing. My father spent 30 years teaching me how to read a job site, how to check your work twice, and how to always, always look up. When I drive up to Haliburton on a Friday evening and build a fire and sit in the reading room while the snow comes down through the spruce outside, I think about that. About what it means to be handed nothing and find everything waiting inside it. About a man who was running out of time and still found a way to make sure I wouldn't. I find him in that cabin every time I go. I don't think I'll ever stop looking for him there.